Texas, 1945. The convoy slowed at the edge of Fort Worth, engines grumbling low beneath a sky so vast it swallowed fear. Through the canvas flaps of the transport trucks, 17 German women stared at streets they had been told were burning cities reduced to ash, population starving, infrastructure shattered by total war. Instead, they saw neon signs glowing in afternoon light, children on bicycles, shop windows stacked with bread, canned goods, fabric bolts and colors propaganda had erased from their imaginations. One prisoner, Margarethe Klein, pressed her palm against the truck's metal frame until it hurt, needing proof this wasn't delirium. The war had taught them to expect rubble. America offered them Saturday afternoon. The women had surrendered 3 months earlier in a scene that now felt distant as childhood. Makeshift field hospital near the Rhine, where German nurses and communication specialists waited for Allied forces with white sheets tied to broomsticks, their hands shaking not from fear of capture, but from exhaustion so complete it had become identity. They expected brutality. The Geneva Convention felt like a luxury item from a world that no longer existed, something discarded along with pre-war certainties about civilization and mercy. Instead, American soldiers offered cigarettes and car rations. A young lieutenant from Ohio spoke to them in careful, formal German he'd learned from a grandmother in Cincinnati. The women were searched, documented, photographed for records that would follow them across an ocean. Then they were loaded onto ships where the bunks had mattresses and the latrines functioned, where meals arrived on metal trays with portions that seemed obscene white bread, canned peaches, coffee with real cream. The Atlantic crossing took 11 days. Below deck, the women existed in a state suspended between relief and dread, whispering theories about their destination. Some believed they were headed to work camps in the American South, cotton fields stretching under brutal sun. Others imagined interrogation facilities, concrete rooms where they would answer for Germany's actions until their voices gave out. Inge Hartmann, a former communications operator from Hamburg, wrote in a diary she kept hidden in her coat lining, "We float between worlds. Behind us, everything is ash. Ahead, only rumors and the unknown." They landed at New York Harbor on a mooring when fog clung to the water like held breath. Through the mist, the Statue of Liberty emerged oxidized green against gray sky, her torch raised in a gesture the women couldn't decode. Was it welcome or warning? The harbor buzzed with activity that seemed impossible for a nation at war. Cargo ships, passenger ferries, tugboats guiding massive vessels into berths. Longshoremen shouted to each other in English, Italian, languages the prisoners couldn't identify. The city beyond rose in vertical glory, buildings so tall they disappeared into low clouds. None of them left the ship. They were kept below deck while American authorities processed paperwork, while the machinery of prisoner transfer churned through bureaucratic channels. But through portholes, they glimpsed the city cars streaming down avenues, pedestrians in clothes without patches, restaurants with full tables visible through plate glass windows. The disconnect between what they saw and what they knew about war created a cognitive dissonance that left several women silent for hours. From New York, trains carried them west. The journey took 3 days, and with each mile, the women's understanding of America's scale grew into something that felt like vertigo. They passed through Pennsylvania's rolling hills, Ohio's farmland stretching infinite and green, Indiana's small towns where children waved at the passing train without knowing who rode inside. At night, they saw cities glowing, Pittsburgh's steel mills burning orange against darkness, Chicago's skyline electric and massive, St. Louis' arch visible even in twilight. The guards on the train were largely indifferent, neither cruel nor particularly kind, existing in that middle space where most human interaction occurs. They brought meals to the POW cars, sandwiches, fruit, water, and paper cups. One guard, an older man from Tennessee, played harmonica in the evening, blues melodies that needed no translation. The women learned American geography through window glass and overheard conversations, piecing together a mental map of distances that dwarfed anything in Europe. Margarethe Klein watched the landscape transform as they moved south and west. The green gave way to brown, trees became sparse, horizons widened until the sky felt like an ocean overhead. She had studied English before the war, enough to understand fragments of guard conversations, enough to catch words like Texas and camp and civilian work detail. The phrases meant little until context gave them shape. They arrived at Camp Swift outside Austin on a Tuesday evening when heat shimmered off the ground like liquid glass, distorting the camp's buildings into shapes that wavered and reformed. The facility sprawled across former ranchland, wooden barracks arranged in precise rows, guard towers at each corner, wire fences marking boundaries between captivity and the enormous Texas landscape beyond. But even here, abundance shocked them: gardens growing vegetables, a mess hall serving meals that included meat, a recreation area with actual grass. The camp commander, Colonel Robert Hayes, addressed them through an interpreter the next morning. He was a tall man with gray hair and a Missouri accent that softened his words even when delivering regulations. The rules were simple. Work assignments would be fair, medical care available, correspondence permitted within limits, attempts at escape punished but not severely. The women would be assigned to various work programs around Texas agricultural support, hospital assistance, clerical work for military administration. What the colonel didn't mention, what none of them expected, was that some assignments would take them into civilian spaces, into the ordinary American life that existed parallel to, but seemingly untouched by the war consuming the world. Lisa Werner was assigned to a hospital in Fort Worth 3 weeks after arrival. She had been a nurse in Germany, trained at a Berlin hospital that no longer existed, and her skills made her valuable enough to be placed in semi-civilian work. The first morning, a guard drove her and 3 other prisoners into the city in an unmarked vehicle, stopping at the hospital's service entrance, where they would enter unseen by most patients and staff. But the drive itself became the education. Fort Worth streets bustled with life that seemed impossible to reconcile with global conflict. Women in summer dresses walked downtown sidewalks, their heels clicking on pavement, their faces absent of the hollowed exhaustion that marked every German civilian Lisa had seen in the war's final months. Men in suits carried briefcases, stopping at corner cafes where signs advertised coffee and donuts for 15 cents. Children ran through a park where grass grew thick and green despite the Texas heat. The shops overwhelmed her. Through the car window, she saw store displays filled with goods, radios, typewriters, clothing, household items, toys. A grocery store's window showcased pyramids of canned vegetables, stacked cans of condensed milk, boxes of crackers, jars of preserves. The abundance wasn't just surprising. It was disorienting, creating a vertigo that made her grip the car door until her knuckles whitened. Inside the hospital, American nurses treated the German prisoners with careful professionalism, not warmth, but not cruelty either. They were shown supply rooms stocked with gauze, antiseptics, pain medication in quantities Lisa hadn't seen since before the war. The wards held wounded servicemen returned from overseas, men with legs in casts, arms in slings, bandaged heads. Some stared at the German women with hostility that was understandable and expected. Others seemed too tired to care about nationality or allegiance. Lisa worked at a post-surgical recovery ward, changing bandages, checking vitals, assisting with meals for patients too weak to feed themselves. The work was familiar, grounding, a return to the identity she'd held before borders collapsed and cities burned. During breaks, she sat in a staff room where American nurses discussed weekend plans, movie dates, grocery shopping, conversations so mundane they felt revolutionary. One afternoon, a senior nurse named Dorothy brought coffee to the staff room and set a cup in front of Lisa without comment. The gesture wasn't friendship exactly, but it wasn't hostility either, just one medical professional acknowledging another. Lisa wrapped both hands around the warm cup and felt tears threaten for reasons she couldn't articulate. The weekend brought different assignments. Some prisoners worked on farms outside the city, helping with harvests that Texas's depleted male workforce couldn't handle alone. Others were assigned to laundry facilities, food processing plants, clerical offices. The work was hard, but not cruel, compensated with small wages deposited into accounts they couldn't access, but that theoretically existed, numbers accumulating against a future that remained impossible to imagine. Ing Hartman found herself assigned to a clerical position at a military supply depot on Fort Worth's outskirts. Her English was stronger than most prisoners, her handwriting neat enough for record keeping, her demeanor compliant enough to be trusted with unsupervised work. Each morning, the same guard drove her to the depot, and each morning they passed through downtown Fort Worth during the city's waking hours. The routine became an education in American civilian life. She watched patterns emerge, the rush of workers heading to offices and factories, the opening of shops at 9, the lunch crowds filling downtown restaurants at noon, the gradual emptying as evening approached. She saw movie theaters advertising films with titles like Spellbound and The Clock, their marquees bright even in daylight. She passed a department store whose window display featured mannequins in elegant dresses, posed in a mock living room with furniture that looked soft and new. One morning in late spring, the guard, a middle-aged man from Oklahoma named Bill, stopped at a traffic light next to a school playground. Children played during recess, their shouts carrying through the car's open window. Girls jumped rope, boys played baseball, a teacher supervised from the shade. The scene was so ordinary, it felt subversive, a glimpse of childhood untouched by air raids, evacuations, the constant mathematics of survival that had defined German children's lives for years. Bill noticed her staring. "Kids," he said, not unkindly. "They don't know much about the war. Too young, mostly. Too far away." Ing nodded, unable to form words around the lump in her throat. In Germany, children hid in bunkers. Here they played baseball. The work at the depot involved cataloging supplies, engine parts, uniform components, medical equipment, food rations. The numbers were staggering, representing a logistical capacity that explained in concrete terms how America was winning the war. But what struck Ing more than the military supplies were the small human details. Workers taking cigarette breaks, secretaries discussing recipes, a bulletin board covered with photographs of employees' children and pets, and weekend activities. During lunch breaks, she ate in a staff cafeteria where civilian workers mixed with military personnel in a casual integration that would have been impossible in German facilities. The food was simple but plentiful sandwiches, soup, coffee, sometimes pie. She sat alone at first, marking her status as prisoner and enemy, but eventually, one of the civilian clerks, an older woman named Marie, began sitting nearby, offering small talk about weather and work that required minimal response, but established a fragile thread of human connection. May arrived with heat that made the air feel solid, thick as water, pressing down on the city until even shadows offered little relief. The prisoners adapted, learning to move slowly during midday hours, to seek shade, to drink water constantly. Some assignments shifted to evening hours when temperatures dropped to merely uncomfortable rather than dangerous. One evening, Lisa and 3 other prisoners were driven through downtown Fort Worth after their hospital shift ended. The streets had transformed. Neon signs glowed against gathering dusk. Coca-Cola in red script, Rexall Drugs in blue, Palace Theater in yellow bulbs that chased each other in patterns. Couples strolled the sidewalks, their arms linked, their laughter audible through the car window. A line formed outside the theater, people dressed for entertainment, their faces relaxed and smiling. The car stopped at another traffic light. To their right, a restaurant's large windows revealed the interior white tablecloths, waitresses in crisp aprons, families eating dinner together. Lisa watched a father cut meat on his daughter's plate, watched the child laugh at something her brother said, watched the mother sip from a water glass, and smile at some private thought. The scene was so utterly normal, so completely divorced from war, that it created a cognitive break in Lisa's understanding of reality. She turned to Margarethe, sitting beside her in the back seat. "This can't be wartime," she whispered in German. Margarethe's jaw tightened. "It is for them. Just not here." The observation hung between them during the drive back to camp. America was at war, its men fighting overseas, its industries producing weapons and supplies, its government mobilizing resources on a massive scale. But civilian life continued with an abundance and normalcy that made the European experience of total war seem like a different universe entirely. No rationing reduced families to hunger. No bombing raids forced nightly evacuations to shelters. No advancing armies threatened cities with imminent destruction. Back at Camp Swift, the women gathered in their barracks as evening settled into night. Conversations moved through the usual topics: work assignments, minor grievances, letters from home that arrived months late with sentences censored into meaninglessness. But increasingly, they discussed America itself, trying to reconcile propaganda's portrait of a nation crumbling under war's pressure with the reality they encountered daily in Fort Worth S streets. The propaganda had been specific and consistent. America was weak, decadent, fragmented by racial conflict and labor strikes. Its infrastructure strained beyond capacity, its population demoralized and eager for peace at any cost. The women had believed it, or at least accepted it as plausible, because alternative information didn't exist, because questioning official narratives carried risks, because propaganda fills empty spaces until reality provides counter-evidence. Reality now provided abundant counter-evidence. America wasn't just surviving the war. It seemed to be thriving despite it, producing goods and maintaining civilian comfort at levels that made German wartime sacrifices look catastrophic by comparison. The implications disturbed more than comforted, raising questions about Germany's leadership, strategy, the honesty of information they'd been given for years. Ing wrote in her diary that night, "Today I watched children play in a schoolyard. They were noisy, carefree, well-fed. I tried to remember the last time I saw German children look that way and realized I couldn't. The comparison is unbearable." Summer deepened. The prisoners settled into routines that began to feel almost normal: work during cooler hours, rest during heat peaks, evening recreation in the camp's limited facilities. Some women formed friendships with American civilians they encountered regularly at work sites. The relationships stayed professional, bounded by regulations and mutual caution, but they existed, small bridges across the chasm of enmity. Dorothy, the senior nurse at Fort Worth's hospital, began teaching Lisa medical English during breaks, terminology for procedures, medications, patient communication. The lessons were practical, improving Lisa's work efficiency, but they also represented something more: an implicit acknowledgement that Lisa would need English skills after the war, that there would be an after, that survival remained possible. One afternoon, Dorothy brought photographs to the staff room, her husband in Navy uniform, her 2 sons in their school pictures. She showed them to Lisa without explanation, just a gesture of shared humanity. Mother to mother, despite Lisa having no children. Nurse to nurse, despite their nations being enemies. Lisa looked at the photographs carefully, noting the boys' smiles, the husband's steady gaze, the ordinary American family that existed in the background of global catastrophe. "They're beautiful," Lisa said in careful English. Dorothy nodded, tucking the photographs back into her purse. "I worry," she admitted. "Every day I worry." The confession created a crack in the wall between them. Fear was universal. Love transcended nationality. The war had made them enemies by geography and politics. But underneath, the same anxieties lived, wanting people safe, wanting the violence to end, wanting return to normal life that felt increasingly distant and abstract. In June, something shifted. News reached the camp that Germany had surrendered, that the European war had ended, that the regime they'd served had collapsed into rubble and recrimination. The women received the information in stunned silence, gathering in the mess hall where the camp's chaplain delivered the announcement with appropriate solemnity. Victory for the Allies meant defeat for Germany, but it also meant the end of immediate danger for prisoners. They wouldn't be bargaining chips in ongoing conflict. They wouldn't face reprisals if American forces suffered setbacks. They existed now in a liminal space, prisoners of a concluded war, waiting for bureaucracy and politics to determine their futures. The work assignments continued. Life at Camp Swift maintained its rhythms, but the psychological landscape transformed. They were no longer representatives of an active enemy force, but remnants of a defeated nation, women caught in history's machinery, waiting for gears to turn and release them toward uncertain futures. Margarethi's assignment changed in early July. Instead of hospital work, she was placed on a detail supporting Fort Worth's public library, shelving books, processing returns, cleaning facilities. The work was easier physically, but harder emotionally. Surrounded by books in English she couldn't read, serving a community that existed in comfortable ignorance of her presence. The library's routines fascinated her. Every afternoon, children arrived for story hour, sitting cross-legged on carpeted floors, while a librarian read from picture books with exaggerated voices and animated gestures. Teenagers occupied study tables, textbooks spread before them, their faces showing the universal expression of students grappling with homework. Adults browsed fiction sections, selecting novels for entertainment, magazines for current events, reference books for practical knowledge. One afternoon, while shelving returns in the children's section, Margarethi noticed a young girl watching her, maybe 8 years old. Blonde braids, summer dress with grass stains on the hem. The child stared with the unself-conscious directness that adults learn to suppress, her eyes curious rather than hostile. "You talk different," the girl observed. Margarethi froze, uncertain whether response was permitted. But the child seemed genuinely curious, not accusatory, so she nodded. "I'm from Germany," she said quietly. The girl considered this. "Is that far?" "Very far." "Why are you here?" The question was complicated beyond the child's ability to understand context. Margarethi settled for simple truth. "The war brought me." The girl nodded as if this made perfect sense. Then she smiled, held up the book in her hands, a picture book about a rabbit, and skipped away to find her mother. The interaction lasted maybe 30 seconds, but stayed with Margarethi for days. The child's uncomplicated curiosity, her acceptance that people came from far places for reasons involving war, but not requiring explanation beyond that. August brought news that made the heat feel suffocating, despite being no worse than previous months. Rumors spread through the camp about a weapon America had used against Japan, something so devastating it had destroyed entire cities in single strikes, killed tens of thousands instantly, forced Japanese surrender within days. Details were scarce and contradictory, but the scale of destruction described felt apocalyptic. The women gathered in small groups, trying to comprehend weapons that made conventional warfare seem quaint. If America possessed such devastating technology, why hadn't they used it against Germany? The question went unanswered, but opened darker implications about mercy, restraint, the specific hatreds that dictated which enemies faced annihilation and which faced conventional defeat. Lisa wrote to her sister in Hamburg, a letter that would take months to arrive, might never arrive, might reach a city. So damaged the address no longer existed. I do not know what kind of world we are returning to. Everything we knew is gone, and what's replacing it frightens me in ways I can't articulate. September arrived with slight temperature drops that felt like mercy. The prisoners had been in Texas 5 months now, long enough that routines felt permanent. That camp life became the new normal, that memories of Germany before the war faded into abstract nostalgia. Then one morning, Ing's supervisor at the supply depot asked if she'd like to have lunch in town, a real lunch, at a restaurant, his treat, just a gesture of appreciation for good work. The invitation carried obvious risks: public appearance with a German prisoner, potential scrutiny from authorities or civilians. But he seemed genuine, and Ing was tired of saying no to small kindnesses. They went to a diner 3 blocks from the depot, a place with checkered floor tiles and chrome fixtures, booths upholstered in red vinyl, a jukebox playing Glenn Miller. Bill ordered for both of them, hamburgers with French fries, Coca-Cola in frosted glasses. The food arrived on white ceramic plates, portions generous, the hamburger thick with lettuce and tomato and pickle. Ing ate slowly, trying to absorb every detail. The diner buzzed with lunch crowd noise conversations about work deadlines and family plans. Laughter from a group of factory workers in the corner booth. The sizzle of the griddle behind the counter. No one stared at her. No one seemed to notice or care that a German prisoner sat eating an American hamburger in an American diner while an American war continued in the Pacific. Bill talked about his family, wife, 2 daughters, a son serving in the Navy somewhere in the Pacific. He showed photographs from his wallet, the same gesture Dorothy had made months earlier, that offering of ordinary life as bridge across impossible divides. "Your English is real good," he said between bites. "I practice," Ing replied. "Every day. I practice." He nodded approvingly. "That'll help you after. When you go home, I mean. Home." The word created vertigo. Ing hadn't allowed herself to think seriously about return, about Germany after defeat, about rebuilding from rubble, both literal and psychological. The future felt too enormous to contemplate, too uncertain to plan for, too dependent on factors beyond her control. The check arrived. Bill paid without ceremony, left a tip on the table, and they drove back to the depot in companionable silence. The lunch meant something Ing couldn't name, yet not quite friendship, but more than professional courtesy. A small act of human decency in a world that had specialized in human cruelty. A moment of normalcy in circumstances designed to prevent exactly that. October brought news that processing for repatriation would begin: interviews, paperwork, medical examinations, the bureaucratic machinery grinding toward eventual return. The timeline stayed vague, measured in months rather than weeks, but the possibility of going home became real enough to cause anxiety attacks among women who had adapted to captivity and now feared freedom's uncertainties. Lisa's hospital work continued through autumn. The wounded servicemen in her ward cycled through arriving broken, healing gradually, eventually discharged to return to civilian life or continued service. She learned their names, heard their stories, changed their bandages, and checked their vitals, and sometimes sat with them when pain made sleep impossible. One soldier, a sergeant from Pennsylvania with shrapnel wounds across his back, asked her one evening where she was from. When she answered, he went quiet for a long moment. "You patched me up real good," he finally said. "Nurse is a nurse, I guess." The observation was simple but profound. War created enemies, but wounds required care, regardless of politics or nationality. The sergeant saw her as a medical professional before seeing her as a German, and that reordering of priorities felt like the first step toward whatever would come after hatred ended. November arrived with cooler temperatures and news that repatriation would begin in January. The women would be shipped back to Germany, dispersed to whatever remained of their home cities, released into a nation they'd left at war and would return to in defeat. The prospect terrified more than excited. Germany had been devastated, occupied, divided among victorious powers, its future uncertain, its immediate present surely harsh. On one of Lisa's last work days at the hospital, Dorothy pulled her aside during a break. She handed Lisa a small package wrapped in brown paper. "For after," Dorothy said simply. Inside were practical items: soap, toothpaste, small bottles of aspirin and iodine, bandages, a comb, safety pins. Basic supplies that would be valuable in a nation stripped of everything. But what struck Lisa was the thoughtfulness, the recognition that she would need these things, the implicit acknowledgement that her life would continue beyond captivity. "Thank you," Lisa managed, her English failing under the weight of emotion. Dorothy nodded. "You're a good nurse." "Don't forget that." The return journey began in January 1946. The women were processed out of Camp Swift, loaded onto trains that reversed their earlier route west to east, Texas to New York, watching America pass by the windows one final time. The landscape had become familiar now, its scale and abundance no longer shocking, but normalized, integrated into their understanding of the world. At New York Harbor, they boarded a troop transport heading back across the Atlantic. The ship was crowded with returning prisoners' men mostly, soldiers captured at different battles, held in different camps, all heading toward the same uncertain homecoming. They sailed in early February, the ocean rough and gray, the ship rolling through swells that made everyone queasy. During the crossing, Ing stood on deck one evening, watching the sunset paint the water in shades of orange and purple. She thought about Fort Worth's streets, the children playing baseball, the neon signs glowing at dusk, the diner with its checkered floor and chrome fixtures. She thought about Bill's kindness, Dorothy's gift, the sergeant who'd called her a good nurse. The propaganda had taught her to hate America, to see it as weak and decadent, an enemy deserving destruction. Instead, she'd found abundance and normalcy, small kindnesses in ordinary people worried about the same things that worried everyone: family safety, work responsibilities, the desire for peace, and return to regular life. None of it erased Germany's actions or absolved its leadership, but it complicated the narrative, added human dimension to enemy status, revealed that beneath political enmity lived universal human concerns. They landed at Hamburg in late February. The city was unrecognizable, entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble, buildings standing as burnt skeletons, streets choked with debris. People moved through the destruction like ghosts, their faces hollow with hunger and exhaustion, their clothes patched beyond utility. The contrast with Fort Worth was so extreme, it felt hallucinatory. Lisa stood on the dock, her small package from Dorothy clutched to her chest, and tried to reconcile the two realities: American abundance and German devastation, enemy streets intact while home cities burned, children playing baseball while German children searched rubble for anything salvageable. She would rebuild. They all would. Germany would recover, eventually, through decades of work and change, and reckoning with what had been done in its name. But Lisa would carry Fort Worth with her always, not as betrayal of her homeland, but as evidence that different futures were possible, that enemies could be human, that small kindnesses survived even in circumstances designed to extinguish them. Years later, when Germany's recovery had progressed enough to allow reflection, when the immediate struggle for survival eased into something resembling normal life, Lisa would try to explain to her nieces what those months in Texas had meant. She would struggle with words, unable to capture the vertigo of seeing enemy streets intact, and thriving the cognitive dissonance of American abundance during wartime, the small human gestures that defeated propaganda more effectively than any weapon. "This can't be wartime," she told Margarete that evening in Fort Worth, watching families eat dinner through restaurant windows. But it was. Just not there. Not in those streets. And that difference, that enormous, unbridgeable difference in how war touched different places, different people, became the education that shaped her understanding of conflict, nationalism, propaganda, and the human capacity for both cruelty and unexpected kindness. The Hamburg dock was cold. Lisa pulled her coat tighter and turned toward the city, toward whatever came next, carrying memories of Texas sunsets and Fort Worth's electric streets, small packages of kindness from former enemies, and the complicated knowledge that the world was larger and more nuanced than any ideology could contain.